From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back, everybody. Kim Strassel wanted to follow up here on this military point in Taiwan. There was a similar crisis in U.S.-China relations over Taiwan in the 1990s when Lee Teng-hui, the then president of Taiwan, wanted to come to the United States under fierce objections by the Chinese, including military threats. President Clinton at the time sent a U.S. carrier through the Taiwan Strait and made clear that the U.S. would signal that it was prepared to defend Taiwan. After about 9 months of shouting back and forth, various exercises, it died down. The difference now, I think, is the Chinese impatience with the reunification, first of all, as we've talked about, but also the relative military balance has changed dramatically. The Chinese have advanced their military power, both naval and in long-range missiles, which now are widely believed to threaten the U.S. carrier fleet and make it that much more difficult to defend Taiwan. And Taiwan, obviously, with only 23 million people, is not as militarily equipped to defend against an invasion, would need help from the U.S., Japan, and others. And this, I think, has given China new confidence that it may be able to take over the island merely by threatening an invasion that would be hard to defend against. And, of course, no one wants a war with China, certainly not over a symbolic visit by the speaker.
Yeah, and of course, the best way to dissuade that is peace through strength. And so I think one big question as Pelosi finishes up this trip is, what's going to be her follow-on? And the obvious answer is that we need some more money for our own military, in particular to beef up our naval forces and to send the message that we are prepared to deal with that Chinese threat as a way of dissuading them from taking any steps like that. In the wake of all of this, there's also been a renewed focus on what you might do to help Taiwan better defend against some sort of invasion, especially in light of some of the things that has been learned in the Ukrainian war. So some more discussion about whether or not we need to help it obtain mobile cruise missiles for coastal defense or naval mines, fast attack craft, mobile artillery, etc. We obviously did a big F-16 sale to them a couple of years ago, but there's going to have to be a bigger focus here about how we are deterring China in that region. And one of the ways to do it is to be talking more about military budgets.
Yeah, I could not agree more, Kim. We have to increase our capacity and our strength relative to China, most importantly, but also, I think, find ways to strengthen Taiwan as well. Let's turn to the NATO vote in the U.S. Senate, historic vote in favor of bringing in Sweden and Finland, two countries that had long preferred neutrality but were driven into the desire to join NATO by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the fear that because Ukraine was not actually a member of NATO, Russia felt it emboldened to invade and bring it under its influence, if not outright annexation. And this is an important vote. Every NATO nation needs to ratify their admission. Now the U.S. has, and the vote was 95-1-1. And that one was one opposition, Josh Hawley of Missouri, and voting not present, Rand Paul of Kentucky. Joe, what do you make of the vote?
First off, the good news is that it was such an overwhelming majority in favor of this very important strategic step for the U.S. and for NATO and our allies in Europe in terms of welcoming these two new members. And bear in mind, just geographically, Sweden and Finland occupy a very important position in that neighborhood. And so I think that it is really important to the alliance that they are now joining. In terms of the opposition to it, you have to give Rand Paul credit for at least being consistent. He has always represented the very deeply isolationist wing within the Republican Party. And so I think that you can at least credit him for whatever principle there is there and for consistency. Rather less explicable is Josh Hawley's opposition to this, which, so far as I can tell, seems to be rooted in his belief that this is all a big distraction from what's going on in Asia, but I think seems to be calculated more towards scoring some kind of political point, although it's hard to know exactly what that point might be.
The military point, Joe, just to buttress it, your point, Finland has an 800-mile border with Russia. So you could say, well, wait a minute. Does NATO really want to undertake that obligation to defend that border? On the other hand, the Finns have a pretty robust military for a small country. And, of course, they famously fought Russia, an invasion many decades ago, which was a lot harder for Russia to win than it should have been. So the Finns are a fighting folk, and their location, I think, would help with the defense of the Baltic states, who abut Russian territory on the Baltic Sea, and they are very vulnerable because they're so small and so close. So I think that's militarily important. As for Rand Paul, Kim, I agree with Joe. I think he doesn't believe in alliances. He doesn't believe in U.S. forward military deployments. He believes in the night watchman state. At least he's consistent on that. What do you make of Josh Hawley's opposition?
Well, it's pure posturing, and I think it's a way of Josh Hawley attempting to get himself some note as he is obviously ramping up for greater aspirations, possibly a presidential run. But there's so many problems with his position, this notion that this is a distraction from China. I mean, first of all, one, can we walk and chew gum at the same time? I wonder what Hawley thinks about the fact that he actually sounds like the Biden administration. This was the argument they made for their cataclysmic withdrawal from Afghanistan. It also doesn't make a lot of sense because, as you and Joe were just describing, in some ways you can actually make the case that by acceding to this and letting Sweden and Finland join, it may be making our work in Europe a little easier in a certain way, in that we're adding two capable countries to this alliance that, as you say, are fighting folk, and maybe that allows us, a little bit more flexibility in terms of what else we're doing. But to just round back, it seems to me very much this is Hawley in some way. I think he started out trying to make it this an American first kind of argument, but given all of the intellectual problems with his position, he ended up landing where he did, that somehow suggesting that we were looking in the wrong direction with this vote.
The senator from Arkansas, Tom Cotton, made a point in the debate of pointing out that Senator Hawley had voted to admit Macedonia and North Montenegro into NATO some years ago, long before the Russian invasion, and noted the contradiction of admitting them, who are much less capable militarily, and not voting to admit Sweden and Finland, and I think that was a telling point. Joe, I'm reassured here by this vote in this debate that there still is bipartisan support, and overwhelming bipartisan support for NATO, for an American forward presence in Europe, and that it's holding, notwithstanding the nation's, particularly a large part of the Republican Party's impatience with forward deployments in the Afghan and Iraq expenditure of lives and treasure. I think the American people still fundamentally understand that withdrawal from the world is an unrealistic position to take. And in particular, the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, which it always exists, is not as large as some have feared.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I want to circle back to this point about China, because I think that this is also kind of encouraging if you keep in mind that this vote on NATO is happening in a context where across the political spectrum in Washington, you have a greater awareness that we do need to be mindful of the situation and the competition or rivalry with China. Kim was talking about this issue of walking and chewing gum at the same time. If you think about America's presence and interests in Asia and then also tending the farm in Europe, I would argue that it's all chewing gum, because the other thing that's going on here is that European countries, especially in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, have also become very mindful of their own exposure economically and strategically to China. And they have learned the lesson from the Ukraine war that you cannot count on doing business with autocrats over the longer term. And from that perspective, I think that America's interests in Asia are served best by deepening the NATO alliance with European partners who are starting to think about Asia in the same way that Washington does. And so I'm also kind of encouraged that Washington seems to be maintaining its ability to think about all of these issues in connection to each other and not just trying to silo everything, because I think that this NATO expansion is going to be very important in terms of European security and America's presence and interests in Europe, but it's also going to end up helping us in Asia too, I think.
There's no question that anytime you sign up to an alliance or expand one, it is not without risks, and bringing Sweden and Finland in means that the U.S. is essentially signed up for defending those countries if they are invaded, much as they would be obliged to defend us if there were a threat to the United States. So it's no small thing. On the other hand, this is a question of deterrence and bringing in 2 more countries to deter Russia from aggression. Principally Russia is going to, in my view anyway, enhance deterrence. I want to thank Kim. I want to thank Joe. Thank you all for listening. Be sure to catch us tomorrow on another edition of Potomac Watch and send those cards and letters into pwpodcast@wsj.com.